The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor as Anthony heard the scream pierce through the wedding celebration. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He had been standing in the shadows of Pine Valley Community Center, watching his 8-year-old daughter Emma twirl on the dance floor in her flower girl dress when the sound froze his blood. Through the open doors of the bridal suite, he glimpsed something that made every instinct from his military training surge to life. Marcus had his hands wrapped around the bride's throat, her white dress twisted as she clawed desperately at his grip. But this wasn't just any bride. This was General Rebecca Strangling, the woman who had destroyed his career 3 years ago with a single signature on discharge papers. Anthony Davis had learned to measure time differently since leaving the Army. Not in months or years, but in the spaces between Emma's nightmares and the moments when she actually smiled. 3 years had passed since General Rebecca Strangling signed his dishonorable discharge papers, branding him unfit for service after what the military tribunal called an incident of insubordination. The truth was more complicated, as truth always is, but Anthony had stopped trying to explain it to people who wouldn't listen. The small apartment above Murphy's Auto Repair in Riverside, Oregon, had become their sanctuary. Emma's drawings covered every available wall space, bright splashes of color that fought against the gray reality of their circumstances. She had been 5 when her mother deployed for the final time, too young to understand that some soldiers never come home, old enough to feel the absence like a missing heartbeat. Anthony had promised Sarah before she left that he would take care of their daughter, never imagining he would be doing it alone, with a discharge that made finding decent work nearly impossible. Riverside was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, which made anonymity impossible, but also created unexpected pockets of kindness. Mrs. Chen at the corner grocery store always slipped Emma an extra candy bar when Anthony wasn't looking. Tom Murphy, the auto shop owner, had given Anthony work despite his military record, understanding that some men just needed a second chance to prove their worth. The job paid enough to keep them fed and housed, though Anthony's dreams of using his engineering degree seemed as distant as the mountains surrounding their small town. Emma attended Oak Ridge Elementary, where her teacher, Miss Rodriguez, had become something of a lifeline for both of them. She never asked intrusive questions about why a former Army captain was picking up his daughter in work clothes that smelled of motor oil and determination. Instead, she focused on Emma's bright mind and gentle spirit, often staying after school to help with homework when Anthony's work ran late. These small acts of grace from strangers had taught Anthony that family wasn't always about blood relations. Sometimes it was about people who chose to care when they didn't have to. The invitation to Marcus and Rebecca's wedding had arrived like a ghost from his past, delivered to the wrong address and forwarded through 3 different postal routes before landing in their mailbox. Emma had been excited when she learned they were invited to a real wedding, her first one, and Anthony couldn't bear to disappoint her by explaining the complicated history between him and the bride. He had convinced himself they would slip in quietly, let Emma enjoy the celebration, and leave without incident. Rebecca probably wouldn't even notice them in the crowd. What Anthony hadn't anticipated was how seeing General Strangling in a wedding dress would affect him. Not romantically, but with a strange mixture of recognition and disbelief.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
This was the same woman who had sat across from him in that sterile conference room, her uniform immaculate, her expression unreadable as she listened to testimonies that painted him as reckless and insubordinate. She had been untouchable then, a career officer whose reputation was built on making tough decisions without flinching. Now she looked vulnerable in a way that seemed almost impossible, her carefully controlled exterior replaced by something softer, more human. The ceremony had been beautiful in the way expensive weddings always are, with flowers that cost more than Anthony made in a month and guests who spoke in the measured tones of military brass and political connections. Marcus Blackwood cut an impressive figure in his dress blues, his chest decorated with commendations that spoke of a distinguished career.
Anthony had watched from the back row as they exchanged vows, wondering if Rebecca felt the same sense of performance he remembered from his own wedding years ago, back when promises felt solid and the future seemed predictable. The silence that followed Anthony's intervention stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Marcus lay unconscious on the marble floor of the bridal suite, his dress uniform wrinkled and stained, while Rebecca Sterling sat against the wall clutching her throat, her wedding dress torn at the shoulder. Security guards rushed in moments later, their radios crackling with urgent communications, but Anthony barely registered their presence. His focus remained fixed on the woman he had just saved, the same woman who had ended his military career with calculated precision. Rebecca's eyes met his across the chaos of the room, and Anthony saw something he had never witnessed during their previous encounters. Recognition mixed with genuine shock, not just surprise at his presence, but something deeper, as if she was seeing him clearly for the first time. The paramedics arrived and began their assessment, checking Marcus for signs of concussion, while another team examined the red marks on Rebecca's neck. Through it all, she kept staring at Anthony with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of unfinished conversations. The police questioning took nearly 2 hours, during which Emma waited patiently in the community center's kitchen with Miss Rodriguez, who had volunteered to stay late when she heard about the incident. Anthony provided his statement with military precision, sticking to the facts without embellishment or emotion. He had heard a scream, investigated, found Marcus assaulting Rebecca, and intervened with appropriate force to stop the attack. The officers seemed satisfied with his account, especially when multiple witnesses confirmed seeing Marcus drinking heavily throughout the reception and becoming increasingly aggressive as the evening progressed. Rebecca's statement corroborated Anthony's version of events, though she spoke in the same measured tones he remembered from their military encounters. She described feeling trapped in an abusive relationship that had escalated over months, how Marcus had threatened her career and reputation if she tried to leave him, how the wedding had been as much about appearances as affection. Her admission that she had been planning to call off the ceremony but feared the professional consequences painted a picture of a woman caught between duty and self-preservation. When the immediate crisis passed and Marcus was transported to the hospital under police custody, Anthony found himself alone with Rebecca in the now empty bridal suite. The silence between them carried 3 years of unspoken tensions, professional grievances, and the strange intimacy that comes from sharing a moment of life-altering violence. Rebecca had changed out of her wedding dress into a simple blue sweater and jeans that someone had brought from her apartment, transforming her from bride back into the woman he remembered, though something fundamental had shifted. "Thank you," Rebecca said finally, her voice hoarse from Marcus's assault. The words seemed to come from a deep, exhausted place within her, inadequate for what had transpired. But Anthony understood that sometimes the simplest expressions carried the deepest meaning. He nodded, unsure of how to respond to gratitude from someone he had considered an enemy for so long. The woman sitting before him bore little resemblance to the cold, calculating officer who had presided over his discharge hearing. "Why did you help me?" Rebecca asked, her question cutting through the awkward politeness. "After everything that happened between us, why didn't you just walk away?" Anthony considered his answer carefully, weighing honesty against diplomacy. He thought about Emma, sleeping peacefully in their apartment, trusting that her father would always do the right thing, regardless of personal cost. "Because it was the right thing to do," Anthony replied simply. "Whatever happened between us in the past doesn't change the fact that you needed help. I took an oath once to protect people, and getting discharged didn't erase that obligation." His words seemed to surprise Rebecca, who studied his face as if searching for hidden motives or calculated strategies. The conversation that followed stretched into the early morning hours, touching on subjects they had never addressed during their professional interactions. Rebecca spoke about the pressure of being one of the few female generals in her command, how every decision was scrutinized for signs of weakness or favoritism. She described the isolation that came with rank, the way authority created distance between her and the soldiers under her command, how she had learned to suppress empathy in favor of efficiency. Anthony found himself sharing details about his life after the military, the challenges of single parenthood,
The way Emma's innocent questions about fairness and justice had forced him to examine his own anger and resentment. He talked about the nights when he questioned whether he had made the right choices, whether his principles were worth the price his daughter was paying for his stubbornness. Rebecca listened without interruption, her expression growing softer as she began to understand the human cost of her administrative decisions. The discussion of his discharge was inevitable, though neither of them approached it directly at first. Instead, they circled around the incident like boxers, testing their opponent's defenses, each sharing pieces of their perspective until a fuller picture began to emerge. Rebecca admitted that she had reviewed his case multiple times over the past 3 years, questioning whether the punishment had fit the crime, whether there had been alternatives she hadn't considered. Anthony explained his side of the story with the same measured tone Rebecca had used in her statement to the police. He had been a captain in charge of a supply convoy when they received intelligence about a planned attack on a local school. Standard protocol required him to wait for backup and clearance from higher command, but the intelligence indicated that children were in immediate danger. He had made the decision to divert his convoy to the school, successfully evacuating 200 students and teachers minutes before insurgents arrived with explosives. The mission had been a success by any reasonable measure, but Anthony had violated direct orders by abandoning his assigned route. The military tribunal focused on his insubordination rather than the lives saved, painting him as a rogue officer who couldn't follow simple commands. Rebecca had been tasked with making the final decision on his punishment, and she had chosen career suicide over commendation, citing the need to maintain discipline and chain of command. "I was wrong," Rebecca said quietly, the admission hanging in the air between them like a confession. "Not about the importance of following orders, but about the context of your decision. I was so focused on the precedent it might set that I forgot about the precedent it actually did set. That sometimes doing the right thing requires courage to act against orders." Anthony felt something shift in his chest at words, not forgiveness exactly, but a loosening of the tight knot of anger he had carried for 3 years. He realized that Rebecca had been carrying her own burden of guilt and doubt, that the decision to discharge him had cost her something as well. They were both casualties of a system that prioritized rules over humanity, procedure over common sense. The conversation eventually turned to more personal matters, the paths their lives had taken since their professional relationship ended. Rebecca spoke about Marcus, how their relationship had begun as a partnership between 2 ambitious officers and gradually evolved into something controlling and possessive. She described the subtle ways he had isolated her from friends and colleagues, the way he had used her position and reputation as leverage to maintain control. Anthony shared stories about Emma, how his daughter had become his anchor and his motivation, the way her unconditional love had helped him rebuild his sense of purpose after losing his military identity. He talked about the community of people who had supported them in Riverside, how ordinary citizens had shown more loyalty and compassion than the institution he had served for 15 years. As dawn broke through the windows of the community center, both Anthony and Rebecca realized that their conversation had accomplished something neither had expected. They had moved beyond their professional antagonism to discover a mutual respect based on shared values and similar experiences. The woman who had ended his military career was also someone who understood the weight of difficult decisions and their unintended consequences. Anthony asked about Emma, expressing genuine interest in meeting the daughter who had clearly become the center of Anthony's world. She spoke about her own regrets regarding family, how her focus on career advancement had cost her relationships and left her isolated in ways that made Marcus's manipulation possible. Anthony found himself inviting her to breakfast at Maple Street Diner, a gesture that surprised them both with its spontaneous warmth. The invitation represented more than just a meal. It was an acknowledgement that their story was more complex than either had realized, that enemies could become allies when circumstances revealed their shared humanity.
As they walked toward the parking lot in the early morning light, both Anthony and Rebecca understood that something fundamental had changed between them, though neither could have predicted where this unexpected connection might lead. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Maple Street Diner as Anthony watched Emma carefully arrange her pancakes into a smiley face, her small tongue poking out in concentration. Rebecca sat across from them, still wearing the borrowed clothes from the night before, looking remarkably composed for someone whose wedding had ended in violence and police statements. The other diners cast curious glances their way, though most were too polite to stare openly at the trio that seemed oddly mismatched, yet somehow natural together. Emma had taken to Rebecca immediately, with the fearless acceptance that children possess before the world teaches them to be cautious. She peppered the general with questions about military life, her eyes wide with fascination as Rebecca described flying in helicopters and traveling to different countries. Anthony found himself relaxing as he watched them interact, seeing Rebecca's carefully maintained professional facade soften under Emma's innocent curiosity. Over the following weeks, what had begun as an unexpected breakfast stretched into regular meetings that none of them had quite planned, but all of them seemed to need. Rebecca was staying at a hotel downtown while she sorted through the legal complexities of her canceled wedding and Marcus's arrest. The assault charges were proceeding through military courts, and Rebecca found herself testifying not just about the attack itself, but about months of escalating abuse that she had hidden from
colleagues and friends. Anthony discovered that Rebecca's isolation ran deeper than professional necessity. She had built walls around herself so effectively that when Marcus began his campaign of control and manipulation, she had no support system to recognize the warning signs or offer assistance. Her parents had died years earlier, and her singular focus on military advancement had left little time for maintaining friendships outside the service. The realization that she was fundamentally alone in the world except for her military identity made Anthony understand why she had clung so fiercely to rules and protocols. They represented the only stability she had ever known. Their relationship developed in the spaces between Anthony's work schedule and Emma's school hours. Rebecca would meet them at the park where Emma played on the swings while the adults talked on nearby benches. She began joining them for dinner at their modest apartment above the auto shop, helping Emma with homework and listening to Anthony's stories about his customers and their various automotive disasters. The general, who had once seemed untouchable, began revealing herself to be someone who laughed at Emma's knock-knock jokes and genuinely enjoyed the simple rhythms of domestic life. Anthony found himself looking forward to Rebecca's visits in ways that surprised and sometimes troubled him. She brought a perspective to their small family unit that he hadn't realized they were missing. Someone who understood military culture, but was discovering civilian life alongside them. Rebecca seemed equally drawn to their routine, often arriving earlier than planned and staying longer than necessary, as if their apartment represented something she had been searching for without knowing it existed. The shift in their relationship from cautious friendship to something deeper happened gradually, in moments so subtle that neither acknowledged them directly. Rebecca's hand lingering on Anthony's shoulder when she said goodnight, the way she automatically straightened Emma's collar before school. Anthony finding himself thinking about Rebecca's opinions when making decisions about Emma's activities or his own work schedule. They were becoming a family without ever discussing what that might mean or whether it was something any of them actually wanted. The complications began when Rebecca's commanding officers started asking questions about her extended stay in Riverside. Military protocol suggested she should have returned to her duties within a reasonable time frame after the wedding incident. But Rebecca kept finding reasons to extend her leave. Her superiors grew suspicious of her reluctance to resume normal operations, especially when routine inquiries revealed she was spending significant time with a dishonorably discharged officer. Colonel Matthews, Rebecca's immediate supervisor and longtime mentor, arrived in Riverside without warning on a Tuesday afternoon. Anthony was working under the hood of Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick when he noticed the military sedan pull up outside Murphy's Auto Repair. The man who emerged wore the bearing of someone accustomed to immediate obedience, his uniform pressed to parade standards despite the casual nature of his visit. The conversation between Matthews and Anthony was cordial, but loaded with unspoken threats. The colonel made it clear that Rebecca's career was under scrutiny, that her association with Anthony was raising questions about her judgment and loyalty. He didn't explicitly order Anthony to stay away from Rebecca, but he painted a vivid picture of what continued contact might cost her professionally. Rebecca had worked too hard and come too far to have her reputation destroyed by an inappropriate relationship with someone of questionable character. Anthony felt the familiar burn of injustice as Matthew spoke, the same helpless anger that had consumed him during his discharge proceedings. The military's ability to reduce complex human relationships to simple matters of protocol and regulation seemed designed to strip the individual of any sense of agency, to crush anything that didn't fit neatly into predetermined categories. But this time, the stakes weren't just his own career and dignity. They involved Rebecca's future and Emma's growing attachment to someone who might disappear from their lives as suddenly as she had appeared. That evening, Anthony sat Emma down for one of the hardest conversations he had ever attempted. He tried to explain that Rebecca might need to go back to her regular job soon, that their time together had been special but temporary. Emma listened with the serious expression she wore when processing difficult information, her 8-year-old mind working to understand adult complications that defied logic. "But she likes us, Daddy," Emma said with the devastating simplicity of childhood, "and we like her. Why can't she just stay?" Anthony struggled to find words that would make sense to his daughter without destroying her faith in fairness and justice. How could he explain that sometimes wanting something wasn't enough, that adult relationships were governed by forces beyond personal preference or mutual affection? The confrontation with Rebecca came 2 days later, in the same park where they had spent so many peaceful afternoons. She had clearly been wrestling with Matthews's ultimatum, her usual composure cracked around the edges with stress and indecision. Anthony could see the conflict playing out in her expression. The woman who cared about them warring with the officer who had spent decades following orders and maintaining discipline. "He's right, you know," Rebecca said without preamble, her voice carrying the flat tone Anthony remembered from their military encounters. "My being here is causing problems for both of us. People are asking questions about my judgment, about my priorities. If I stay much longer, it could destroy everything I've worked for." Anthony felt something cold settle in his chest, though he had been expecting this conversation since Matthews's visit. "And if you leave?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Rebecca's silence stretched between them like a chasm, opening up to swallow whatever they had been building together. "I have to think about Emma," Anthony continued, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "She's already lost too much. Her mother, the stability of military life, the community we used to have. I can't let her get more attached to someone who might disappear when things get complicated." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away, her military training reasserting itself even in this moment of personal crisis. "You're right," she whispered. "I shouldn't have let this happen. I should have kept my distance from the beginning. I knew better." The agreement to end their relationship felt like signing another discharge document, official and final and completely wrong. Anthony watched Rebecca walk away from the park, her shoulders squared in the posture he recognized from their first meeting, and he wondered if he was making the same mistake twice, choosing protocol over principle, safety over courage. That night, Emma asked why Miss Rebecca hadn't come to dinner, and Anthony found himself lying to his daughter for the first time in years. He said Rebecca had to work late, that she would see them soon, promises that tasted like ash in his mouth. Emma accepted his explanation with the trust children give to parents they believe will always tell them the truth, making Anthony's deception feel even more corrosive. Rebecca left Riverside the next morning without saying goodbye, returning to her duties at the Regional Command Center 3 hours away. She sent a brief text thanking Anthony for everything and promising to never forget their kindness, words that felt as formal and distant as the military communications he remembered from his service days. The apartment felt hollow. Without her presence, Emma's questions about Rebecca's absence growing more persistent and worried as days passed without explanation. Anthony found himself angry again, but this time the anger was different, more complex and painful than the straightforward rage he had felt after his discharge. He was angry at a system that punished connection and demanded isolation, angry at himself for caring enough to get hurt, angry at Rebecca for choosing her career over their relationship, and angry at his own hypocrisy for expecting her to make a different choice than he would have made in her position. The loneliness that settled over their small family felt heavier than before Rebecca's arrival, weighted with the knowledge of what they were missing rather than simple acceptance of what they had never had. Emma's bright chatter dimmed, her drawings featuring fewer people in more empty spaces. Anthony threw himself into work with desperate intensity, staying late at the shop and taking on extra projects that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. 3 weeks after Rebecca's departure, Matthews returned to Riverside with news that shattered whatever remained of Anthony's faith in military justice. Rebecca was being investigated for conduct unbecoming an officer, her relationship with Anthony cited as evidence of poor judgment and questionable loyalty. The investigation threatened not just her current position, but her entire military pension and benefits, decades of service potentially erased by a few weeks of human connection. The news of Rebecca's investigation hit Anthony like a physical blow, leaving him staring at Matthews across the cluttered desk of Murphy's auto repair while the colonel's words echoed in the sudden silence. Emma was at school, blissfully unaware that the woman she had grown to love was facing the same military tribunal system that had destroyed her father's career. Anthony's hands tightened around the wrench he had been holding, his knuckles white against the metal as he processed the implications of what Matthews had just revealed. "This is exactly what I warned you about," Matthews continued, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose predictions had proven correct. "General Sterling's association with you has compromised her position beyond repair. The investigation committee is treating her relationship with a dishonorably discharged officer as evidence of fundamental character flaws that call into question every decision she's made throughout her career." Anthony set down the wrench carefully, fighting the urge to throw it through the garage window. The injustice burned in his throat like acid, the familiar rage that had consumed him during his own discharge proceedings, threatening to overwhelm his rational thinking. Rebecca was being destroyed, not for any actual wrongdoing, but for the crime of seeing his humanity beyond his military record. "What do they want?" Anthony asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Matthews smiled with the cold precision of someone who had orchestrated this exact scenario, a predator who had cornered his prey and was savoring the moment before delivering the final blow. "Complete severance of contact. A written statement from you acknowledging that your relationship with General Sterling was inappropriate and that you initiated the contact despite knowing it could damage her career. Sign that document, and the investigation committee might consider reducing her punishment to early retirement with partial benefits instead of complete disgrace." The paper Matthews slid across the desk looked official and final, dense with legal language that Anthony recognized from his own military experience. It was a confession that painted him as a manipulator who had exploited Rebecca's vulnerability for personal gain, a predator who had targeted a superior officer and compromised her integrity through calculated seduction. Every word was carefully chosen to absolve the military system, while casting Anthony as the villain in a story that bore no resemblance to the truth.
Anthony read through the document twice, his anger transforming into something colder and more dangerous. This wasn't just about protecting Rebecca's career anymore. It was about accepting a narrative that made him responsible for the military's systematic failure to support its own personnel. They wanted him to become the scapegoat for Rebecca's investigation, to shoulder blame for crimes he hadn't committed in exchange for mercy he couldn't guarantee. "And if I don't sign?" Anthony asked, though Matthews's expression made the answer clear. The colonel leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who held all the cards, his smile widening as he prepared to deliver the final ultimatum. Then General Strangling faces the full consequences of her poor judgment. Court-martial, complete loss of rank and benefits, possible criminal charges related to conduct unbecoming an officer. Her career will be destroyed so thoroughly that no military contractor or government agency will ever consider hiring her. She'll lose everything she's worked for over 20 years of distinguished service. The weight of Rebecca's future settled on Anthony's shoulders like a physical burden, heavier than anything he had carried during his military service. He thought about Emma asking why Miss Rebecca hadn't come to dinner, about the way Rebecca had looked when she played with his daughter, about the vulnerability she had shown during their late-night conversations. The woman who had ended his career was now facing the same systematic destruction, and he held the power to save or damn her with his signature. Anthony stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the concrete floor with a sound that made Matthews flinch slightly. The colonel's confidence wavered as he took in Anthony's expression, the cold fury that had replaced the earlier shock and pain. This wasn't the broken veteran Matthews had expected to manipulate. This was the soldier who had once risked his career to save 200 children from a terrorist attack. "I need time to think about this," Anthony said, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that made Matthews shift uncomfortably in his seat. The colonel had clearly expected immediate capitulation, a desperate man willing to sign anything to protect someone he cared about. Instead, he was facing a calculation that he couldn't predict or control. "You have 24 hours, Matthews replied, attempting to reassert his authority. "The investigation committee meets tomorrow afternoon, and they'll want your statement before making their final recommendations. Don't let misguided loyalty destroy what's left of General Strangling career, Davis. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is accept responsibility for your mistakes." After Matthews left, Anthony sat alone in the garage, surrounded by the familiar smells of motor oil and metal shavings, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. The document remained on his desk like a loaded weapon, its implications spreading through his thoughts like poison. Signing it would save Rebecca's career, but destroy any chance of clearing his own name or challenging the system that had wronged them both. Refusing to sign would preserve his integrity but potentially cost Rebecca everything she had worked to achieve. The afternoon dragged by with agonizing slowness as Anthony wrestled with the impossible choice Matthews had presented. He found himself unable to concentrate on work, making careless mistakes that forced him to redo simple repairs. Tom Murphy noticed his distraction but wisely chose not to ask questions, offering only a supportive nod when Anthony explained he was dealing with some personal issues. When Emma arrived home from school, her cheerful chatter about playground adventures and spelling tests felt like a lifeline to normalcy. Anthony helped her with homework and made dinner while wrestling with the knowledge that his decision would affect not just Rebecca's future, but Emma's understanding of justice and courage. How could he explain to his daughter that sometimes doing the right thing required accepting false blame? How could he teach her to stand up for truth while signing a document filled with lies? The evening news carried a brief story about military personnel reforms, featuring interviews with former officers who described systemic problems within the justice system. Anthony watched with bitter irony as talking heads discussed the need for accountability and transparency, while the same system prepared to destroy Rebecca for the crime of human connection. The reform advocates spoke eloquently about protecting whistleblowers and supporting victims of military injustice, but their words felt hollow when measured against the reality of Matthews' ultimatum. That night, after putting Emma to bed, Anthony called his old friend David Rodriguez, the only person who had maintained contact with him after his discharge. David had served as Anthony's mentor during his early military career, a master sergeant who understood the difference between following orders and following conscience. Their conversation lasted until nearly midnight, David listening patiently as Anthony described the situation and his impossible choice. "The system is designed to protect itself," David said finally, his voice heavy with years of experience fighting similar battles. "They'll always find someone to blame when things go wrong, and they'll always choose the person with the least power to defend themselves. But here's what I learned after 30 years in uniform. Sometimes the only way to beat the system is to refuse to play by its rules. David's words crystallized something that had been forming in Anthony's mind throughout the day. A plan that was either brilliant or completely insane. Instead of choosing between signing Matthew's confession or letting Rebecca face destruction alone, Anthony began considering a third option that would require courage he wasn't sure he possessed and allies he wasn't certain he could find. The next morning, Anthony dropped Emma off at school with a kiss and a promise that everything would be okay, words that felt like a prayer more than a certainty. Instead of going to work, he drove to the regional headquarters where Rebecca was stationed, a journey that took him through mountain passes and small towns that reminded him of the America he had sworn to defend during his oath of enlistment. The base security checkpoint represented a threshold Anthony hadn't crossed since his discharge, a boundary between his civilian life and the military world that had rejected him. The young guard who checked his identification looked uncomfortable when the computer flagged Anthony's status, clearly uncertain about protocol for dealing with someone whose service had ended in disgrace. After several phone calls and a wait that stretched nearly an hour, Anthony was granted a visitor's pass with strict limitations on where he could go and whom he could see. Rebecca's office was located in a nondescript building that housed administrative functions, far from the operational centers where real military decisions were made. The hallway smelled of floor wax and bureaucracy, filled with the quiet efficiency of people processing paperwork that determined other people's fates. Anthony announced himself to Rebecca's aide, a young lieutenant who seemed surprised by his civilian clothes and uncertain about how to address someone of unclear status. When Rebecca emerged from her office, Anthony was struck by how much she had changed in the few weeks since their separation. Her uniform was still immaculate, but something in her posture suggested defeat, as if she was carrying an invisible weight that grew heavier with each passing day. Her eyes widened when she saw him, a mixture of hope and fear crossing her features before she schooled her expression back to professional neutrality. "Mr. Davis," she said formally, using his civilian title in a way that felt like a small betrayal. "I wasn't expecting to see you here. I thought we had agreed that contact between us wasn't appropriate given the circumstances." Anthony stepped closer, lowering his voice so the aide could hear their conversation. "We need to talk, Rebecca. Matthews came to see me yesterday with some interesting proposals about your investigation. I think you should know what they're offering before you make any decisions about your future." Rebecca's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly at the mention of Matthews's visit, fear flickering in her eyes before she regained control. She glanced around the office, noting the curious looks from other personnel who had noticed Anthony's arrival. The weight of surveillance and judgment was palpable, a reminder that their every interaction would be scrutinized for evidence of impropriety. "Follow me," Rebecca said quietly, leading Anthony to a small conference room where they could speak privately. As she closed the door behind them, Anthony realized that this conversation would determine not just Rebecca's fate, but the direction of his own life and his daughter's future. The document in his pocket felt like it was burning against his chest, Matthews's ultimatum hanging over them both like a sword ready to fall. In the sterile conference room, Anthony pulled out his phone and showed Rebecca the recording app that had been running since he entered the building. Her eyes widened as she realized what he had done, the calculated risk he had taken to expose the truth rather than accept Matthews's false narrative. "I recorded everything Matthews said yesterday," Anthony explained quietly. "His threats, his ultimatums, his admission that this investigation is about punishing you for associating with me rather than any actual wrongdoing. I'm going to release this recording to every military reform organization and journalist I can find." Rebecca stared at him in shock, understanding immediately that Anthony was sacrificing his own safety to protect her reputation.
Releasing the recording would expose Matthews's corruption, but would also paint Anthony as an even bigger target for military retaliation. He was choosing truth over self-preservation, courage over compliance. "You can't do this," Rebecca whispered. "They'll destroy you completely, make your life impossible. What about Emma?" Anthony's expression softened at the mention of his daughter, but his resolve remained unshaken. "Emma needs to see that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it's dangerous," he replied. "I won't sign a confession for crimes I didn't commit, and I won't let them destroy you for caring about us. We're going to expose this system for what it really is." Within hours of Anthony releasing the recording to military reform advocates and investigative journalists, the story exploded across social media and news outlets. The audio of Matthews's threats and ultimatums provided undeniable evidence of the corruption within military justice systems, sparking outrage from veterans groups and civilian oversight committees. The investigation into Rebecca's conduct was suspended pending a review of Matthews's actions. Congressional representatives called for hearings into military tribunal procedures, using Anthony and Rebecca's case as evidence of systematic abuse. Matthews found himself facing the same scrutiny he had inflicted on others, his career crumbling under the weight of public exposure. 6 months later, Anthony stood in the community center where he had first intervened in Rebecca's assault, but this time the occasion was celebration rather than crisis. Rebecca had been fully exonerated and promoted to a position overseeing military justice reforms. Anthony's discharge had been overturned, his record cleared, and he had been offered reinstatement with back pay and benefits. More importantly, they had chosen each other. Rebecca had resigned her commission to move to Riverside permanently, accepting a position with a veterans advocacy organization where she could use her experience to help other service members facing injustice. She and Anthony were planning a simple wedding at Maple Street Diner, the place where their relationship had truly begun.
Emma twirled in her flower girl dress, practicing for the ceremony,
chattering excitedly about her new family. She had adapted to having Rebecca as a constant presence with the resilience children possess, welcoming the stability and love that came with their unconventional partnership. The community that had supported Anthony during his darkest period had embraced Rebecca with equal warmth. Mrs. Chen slipped Emma extra candy bars for both her parents now. Tom Murphy had offered Rebecca part-time work at the garage when she needed a break from advocacy work. Miss Rodriguez had become a family friend who joined them for Sunday dinners. As Anthony watched Rebecca help Emma with her wedding preparations, he marveled at how completely their lives had transformed. The woman who had once ended his military career had become his greatest ally in the fight for justice. The system that had tried to keep them apart had ultimately been exposed and reformed through their courage to stand together. Their love story had become something larger than personal happiness. It had sparked conversations about military culture, inspired other veterans to speak out against injustice, and demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply refusing to accept lies as truth. When Rebecca kissed him at their wedding ceremony, surrounded by the friends and community who had supported their journey, Anthony understood that they had won more than just their personal battle. They had proven that love could triumph over institutional power, that ordinary people could challenge corrupt systems and create lasting change. Emma's laughter echoed through the diner as she announced to anyone who would listen that she now had the best family in the whole world. Looking at his wife and daughter, Anthony couldn't argue with that assessment.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.